Today we're going to be learning Yevamot Daf Tzadi Aleph. We're going to get started at the bottom of Tzadi Amud Bet. But before I do that, I just want to review this very, very important Mishnah that we're in the middle of to get it clear before we get started. So we started with Pei Zayin Amud Bet. I'm just going to review again. Isha shalach ba'ala medinat hayam. So the woman goes abroad. They tell her your husband died. It says they tell her, even though we talked about this, the Mishnah, the language is very difficult because in the end they're going to say it's one witness told her, not they told her, plural. It was only one witness. Based on that, she goes and gets married. And we said, and then we make, right, she ends up with a big mess. She has to get divorced from both husbands. She loses her ketubah rights. He loses his ketubah rights. They end up with, he can't become impure to her. They're really not married at all, even though they are still married. If she's a bat Kohen, if she's a bat Yisrael, she can never marry a Kohen anymore. If she's a bat Levi, she can't eat Maser anymore. If she's a bat Kohen, she can't eat Truma anymore. She gets disqualified all over the place. They're her people who inherit her, the people who, we'll see exactly what this is, but the children can inherit the ketubah of either husband. We'll talk about that later, what that means. If they die, then there's yibum. Well, no yibum in this case, because since she can't be married to either one of them, the yibum for either one of them is not relevant. I mean, in the end, she has to do chalitza, but not yibum. Then we started to see some other opinions that were more lenient in different ways. So I'm going to read them inside because we're going to get to them today. Rabbi Yossi Omer, ktubata al nechsei ba'ala rishon. She gets her ketubah from her first husband. She does, okay? Because again, if she's going to be married to either one of them, it's going to be the first one. Remember, the marriage to the second one is invalid because she's a married woman. But in any case, we treat it as if, right, she still needs a divorce from him and all that, which we explain why, right? Because we don't want it to look like she was married and isn't married and that you don't need to get. So we're stringent, right? But really, she's not really married to the second one. And that's what Rabbi Yossi says. She does get her first husband's ketubah because she was really married to him. Okay. Secondly, Rabbi Elazar Omer, second opinion or third opinion here, because there's Tanakama, there's Rabbi Yossi, and then there's Rabbi Elazar. Harishon zakai b'mitziatav masei yadeh v'havara nedareh. The first husband gets all the parts that he's supposed to get, right? He can get her lost items that she finds are his, her income goes to him, and he can nullify her vows. And Rabbi Shimon says, if they were to do yibum with one of the brothers of the first husband, did yibum or chalitza with her, that would exempt the second wife because really they're married. Okay, so and the vlad is not going to be mamzer from the first husband. So the question is, what's the interplay between these three? Does each one agree? Does Rabbi Yossi agree with Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, or Rabbi Elazar agrees with Rabbi Shimon, or is it the verse? Rabbi Elazar is building on Rabbi Yossi, but Rabbi Yossi wouldn't hold like Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Shimon builds on Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar. We're going to see machloket in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, which way it goes. Then we get to the second case, which we're going to deal with a lot today, which is im niseit shelo b'rashut muteret lachzor lo. But if she gets married without permission, which sounds worse than the first case, but no, it's not worse than the first case because the law is more lenient, and therefore the rabbis say this must be something else other than what meets the eye, which is she can go back to her first husband. Now, why is that? So they assume this must be a case of two witnesses just without the court, okay? And then if the court comes in, then she becomes exempt from the sacrifice because, right, she has to bring korban chatat because in the end she did something wrong by accident. But if it's on the court's hands and they ruled by two witnesses, then even if they ruled by one witness, she would be exempt from a sacrifice. We'll get to all the sacrifices another day. But right now we're going to deal with those elements that we read today. So starting from the bottom of Tzadi Amud Bet, Hayta bat Yisrael nifselet min hakuna. If she's the daughter of a Yisrael, she now is no longer allowed to marry a Kohen. Why? Because she was a married woman who slept with somebody else. We know a Kohen, that if someone gets raped, they can't be married to them at all. So here also, right? So they say, pshita, isn't this obvious that she can? Because right, I mean, obviously she's considered a zonah halachically that wouldn't be allowed. So they say, bat levi min hamaser itzricha. Right, sorry, the woman who's raped, no, why am I confusing it? This is definitely if he was married to someone and she got raped in the interim, she wouldn't be allowed to go back to him, right? So this would be a similar case where she was neshedish, right? Not raped here, but she ended up in a relationship with someone who was forbidden to her. And even though she didn't know that, so obviously she's forbidden. So why does it say this? Well, it's really, they gave this just to set up Yisrael, Levi, Cohen. What are the ramifications for everyone? For Yisrael, the only ramifications are about Yisrael is that she can't marry Cohen. But it's obvious, but they set it up to show, well, but Levi min hamaser itzricha. They needed it to set up the foil. the daughter of a Levi can't eat Maser anymore. And then also the daughter of a Kohen can't go back to eating Truma. So now they say about Levi min Maser, mi mifsaleh b'znut. Wait a minute. Why can't about Levi eat Maser? Who's to say that just because she was a zonah, again, even in a not intentional zonah, but still she's considered a zonah halachically. Because again, why do we blame her? Remember, we blame her because she should have checked. We assume if her husband was really alive, she should have checked into it. So now we're going to bring a braita that seems to indicate not. If you have a Leviah that gets taken into captivity, now the assumption is if you were taken captive by the enemy, they probably raped the woman. Or she engaged in some improper relationship. You're not disqualified from eating maser. So why would we disqualify this woman? So I'm Rav Sheshet, Knasa. Rav Sheshet says, look, this is just one of the penalties that they instituted for this woman. Okay, we know that there were all sorts of penalties instituted. This is just one of them. Bat Kohen and Truma, again, isn't this obvious? Obviously, a Bat Kohen from Truma can't. We know all the laws. So of course, she can't go back to eat Truma. She was in some improper relationship. So they say, afilu b'truma de Rabbanit. Even if it was Truma, that was only by rabbinic law. What would be Truma by rabbinic law? I'll give you a simple example. Vegetables are only chayav in Truma on a rabbinic level. Because in the Torah, it's just dagan, all the grains, tirosh, and yitzhar, which are the olives and the wine. So therefore, right, the tirosh is the wine, the yitzhar is the olives. So anything else is only Truma de Rabbanit. Even that, she can't go back to eating. You might think, well, maybe we don't penalize her for that. No, we do. Now, the children don't inherit her ketubah. Now, what are we talking about? Ketubah ma'avidata. What kind of ketubah? The ketubah doesn't go to her. So, of course, her children don't inherit it. She doesn't get her ketubah. She loses her rights. So, Amar Papa, what are we talking about? Ketubah benin dich. This is a very interesting halacha. It's by Torah law, if I get money in my ketubah. It's first of all what the husband promises me in the event of death or divorce. If I die first, I predecease him, I don't get any of it. But what happens if I die? Let's say that there's all these things I brought into the marriage that go into the ketubah, like my dowry. So my dowry is written up in the ketubah. What happens to that if I die first? If I die first, not only does the husband not have to pay me my ketubah, but he gets all the dowry stuff. It all goes to him. Now, what's the problem? The problem is, what if I die and then he dies? What happens to all his stuff? It gets divided equally among his children, right? Okay, the Bechor, the oldest, gets 2 portions and everyone else gets 1 portion. Now, he presumably might have children from another marriage. This created, so by Torah law, all his children fair evenly inherit my ketubah money, okay? If I die and then he dies. Because of that, fathers didn't want to give big dowries because they said, look, if our daughter dies first, all our money is going to end up split equally between all of his sons. We don't want that to happen. So the rabbis instituted, kind of against Torah law, again, one of those things, right, to change Torah law, that we're going to now say that goes to her male children. So when she dies, it goes to the husband. When the husband dies, it goes to, right, this sounds very similar about a will somebody might write for a second marriage, right? You can imagine a similar thing going on. So we say that in this case, she's going to basically end up, her sons are going to get her ketubah, okay? Her nedunya, her dowry, all the things she brought into the marriage go to her male son. In this case, they don't. That's the whole thing. Another penalty, okay? So let's read it again. Now you'll understand. Ein yorshim yorshav shel zeh v'yorshav shel zeh yorshim ketubata. Okay, the sons from those men don't get her portion. They'll just equally, when she dies and then they die, all her dowry money gets divided evenly between all the sons. So, Amar Papa, so now they say pshita, isn't it obvious? Why? Of course, it would be obvious that this were the case. So they say, Ma'u detema ledida da'avdi surah kansura rabbanan, lizara lo kansura rabbanan, kamashmalan. You might have thought, no. In other words, it's true she loses her rights to the ketubah, but maybe her male sons still keep their rights. They did nothing wrong. Maybe the knas is only on her. In the end, no. The knas is on her and her children as well. Okay, so now we have in the Mishnah, if she's married to 2 husbands now, theoretically. She's not really married to the second, right? And she's supposed to get divorced from both of them. But when it comes to laws of chalitza, if they were to die before they divorced her, they would have to do, she would have to do chalitza with both of them, but no yibum. So now they say, even though it sounds like it's equal, it's not really equal here. Because again, the first marriage is a valid marriage. The second marriage isn't a valid marriage. We're just being stringent as if it was a valid marriage. So therefore, so the first husband is obligated in chalitza on a rabbinic level, right? If he dies, she's obligated to deal, if he didn't divorce her yet, she has to do chalitza on a doraita level. But even yibum, she has to do on a doraita level. But the rabbi said, well, we're not going to have you do yibum because you weren't supposed to be, you're supposed to divorce this husband. So we're definitely not going to allow you to do yibum with his brother. So on a Rabbanit level, you do yibum. Theoretically, you could have done yibum on a Torah level because again, on a Torah level, she's still married to the husband who disappeared. When he shows up on the scene, we thought he was dead. It turns out he wasn't. She was all the while married to him. So theoretically, she's obligated on a Torah level, but the rabbi said, don't do yibum because we don't want to show that you really were married to your husband. You're supposed to get divorced from him. So we say yibum na chalitza, but chalitza is a Torah chalitza. When it comes to the second one, though, remember, the whole get she only gets michumra. Also, chalitza is only a chumra of the rabbis who and say we kind of view like you married the second guy, even though the second marriage isn't valid at all because you're a married woman. A married woman goes and marries someone else, not a valid marriage. So, right, we say ein kiddushin tofsim. Remember? So we say here, achiv shel sheni choletz midirabanan v'lo miyabeim lo midoraita v'lo midorabanan. There's no yibum obligation, not on a Torah level, not on a rabbinic level. It's only that the rabbis, the same way they institute get, they institute a chalitza. So that you shouldn't think that you could get out of a marriage without doing get, or you could get out of a marriage without doing chalitza. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Now we're going to get to these opinions about Rabbi Yossi. I'm going to pull up the chart, the study guide. It's in Hebrew, but we'll go through it together and it'll be useful. Okay, so now we get to these three opinions. So again, let's just review them. Rabbi Yossi said she gets the ketubah of the first husband. Rabbi Elazar says the husband gets certain rights to the women's stuff, to the women's items, the first husband. Rabbi Shimon says the first husband, even if he does yibum or chalitza, that exempts the other wife, and the vlad is not a mamzer. Okay, so he's the so now we're going to see who holds like who. We're going to have two approaches. That's why there's a chart here. Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Huna says, "Batrai modu lekamai, kamai lo modu lebatrai." The later ones agree with the earlier ones, meaning each one builds on the previous. So Rabbi Yossi holds only by his. Rabbi Elazar holds both Rabbi Yossi and his. Rabbi Shimon holds all of them. What's the logic? So Rabbi Shimon modile Rabbi Elazar. Why? Here I wrote the main thing that defines them. Rabbi Shimon is talking about a forbidden relationship, basically, right? A physical relationship between them. Now, the whole issue is she's married to husband number one. He goes off. She thinks he's dead. She marries guy number two. The law is she has to get divorced from guy number one, meaning they can't have a sexual relationship. Now she engages in yibum with his brother, and yet Rabbi Shimon says it's no problem. Or they had a vlad, and the vlad's a mamzer, is not a mamzer, according to Rabbi Shimon. He's not so worried about bia. Now the whole issue is she's not allowed to be married to him, so the sexual relationship is what's forbidden, and yet he's lenient. So all the more so, the other stuff is just monetary. That's definitely much lighter than bi'ah. So we're going to say, if Rabbi Shimon permits the bi'ah and says, oh, well, if she did yibum, that works, then, and the vlad's not going to be a mamzer from her first husband if she ends up staying married to him, obviously when it comes to the financial things, he's going to be lenient about that. Rabbi Elazar, the middle position, lo module Rabbi Shimon. He's not going to agree with Rabbi Shimon for the exact same reason. We're now going to do the reverse logic, the same logic, but in the other direction. When it comes to financial things, we're not going to penalize him. Right? The whole problem was because she had this forbidden relationship with the other guy. So when it comes to bi'ah, it's forbidden, we're going to penalize. But both of them agree with Rabbi Yossi. Why? Now we have to distinguish. So first we have to distinguish between bi'ah, a physical relationship, versus mammon, which is financial things. And mammon is obviously lighter. But now within the financial, we have her ketubah that she gets from her first husband, and we have the rights that the husband has to her items. But what's the difference between the two, according to the first reading? So now, both agree with Rabbi Yossi. Why? Because Rabbi Yossi, Hani diyat vetute lo kanse, bekoshken ktuba de la mishkal umefakah. Let's just define what these are first. The ktuba, the purpose of the ktuba is she receives it when they get divorced. So it's something that is used when they separate. Rabbi Elazar is talking about the mitzia item she finds, her income, and his ability to nullify her vows. Those are only things, in the words of the Gemara, diyat vetute. They're only valid when she's actually married to him. As soon as they get divorced, right? These are things that are only valid during the marriage. So now, which is the more likely one that you would say doesn't apply? The things in the middle category of the mitzia, masayadeh, and all that, where they basically are things while they're together. Now, the whole reason why we put in all these penalties is we want to make sure they get divorced. We need to separate these people. These are things that connect them because kol od he's getting those things, he's going to want to stay married to her. So if Rabbi Elazar doesn't penalize him for that, of course he's not going to penalize her for getting her ketubah, because the ketubah is something that separates them, and we want to separate them. So if he hopes that the husband gets all those things that bring them together and might prevent him from divorcing her quickly, of course the ketubah she will get. Okay, it's a certain kind of logic. Okay. Rabbi Yossi lo modelu, but he doesn't agree with the other two at all. Why? Because again, the same reason, going the reverse. If you say ketubah de mishkal umefaku de lo kanis, because it specifically separates between them, that's why we didn't penalize. Because again, we want them to get divorced, so she'll get her ketubah, and that'll be the end of it. Avahani diate tute kanis, but the items that he's going to get while they're still together, we don't want him to get them because that will prevent him from divorcing her. And obviously, he's not going to allow bi'ah, which is isur. We already said that. Rabbi Yochanan now comes and brings a totally different logic. Okay, he's going to look at these three opinions in a very different light. Rabbi Yochanan Amal, and he's going to say the exact reverse. Kamai modulu batrai, batrai lo modulu kamai. Okay, the first one, Rabbi Yossi agrees with Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Elazar agrees with Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon doesn't agree with either of them. And Rabbi Elazar doesn't agree with Rabbi Yossi, right? Each one first agrees with all. Rabbi Elazar agrees with Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon stands alone. So now we're going to have a totally different logic, because if we use the same logic, we certainly won't come to that conclusion. Rabbi Yossi modilele Rabbi Elazar. Why? Ketubah, he looks from a different perspective. The ketubah is who's right. It's the woman's right. And who are we penalizing here? The woman. Again, as unfair as it is, we say it's her. It's certainly not the husband's fault. I mean, maybe it's his fault for not coming back, but we don't know why he didn't come back. But the point is, it was her fault for relying on that one witness and getting remarried. She should have done her research better. So we say here, if you're Rabbi Yossi, he's going to say, Modele Rabbi Elazar. Ketubah de midide ledida. Dide is him, and dida is who? Ketubah goes from him to her, to the woman. Lokanis, if he doesn't think we penalize that case, kol shekem mitziatau ma'aseh adeh de midida ledide. The mitzia, the masay adeh, go to the husband. That's his rights. If we're not going to penalize her with her rights, we're certainly not going to penalize him. There's no way, right? There's no reason to penalize just him. Rabbi Elazar lo modele, but here we'll again use that logic to say, I don't agree with you, Rabbi Yossi. I only think the things that go to the man, we're not penalizing, but the things that go to the woman, of course, we're going to penalize. So mitziatal masay adeh hu demidida ledide lo kanis, because they're going from her to him, we don't penalize. Aval ketubah demidide ledida, because the ketubah goes to her, we're going to be kanis, we're going to penalize. Uchravayu modele Rabbi Shimon. Now, what's the difference between case 1 and 2? That we have pretty clear. One goes to the woman, one goes to the man. What about this case of chalitza or yibum? So there's a huge difference between chalitza and yibum. Remember what we said. The whole idea is we want to separate between them. We want them to get divorced. Now, if we're talking about a yibum case, what's the situation? Well, already, right, they're not married anymore because he died. So therefore, we're not in a rush to separate them. He's already dead. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon, we're now going to say, Rabbi Shimon, they all agree with Rabbi Shimon because Mahani de Michayim lo kanse. The ketubah and the masay adeh are all when he's still alive and she's still alive, and therefore there's no, and yet we're not penalizing them. Of course, when he dies and we're talking about the brother having relations with her, we don't care anymore because the husband's already dead. The whole idea was to separate her from the husband. For Rabbi Shimon, but he won't agree with the others because he'll say, right? Specifically, he thinks the case of chalitza, or yibum, we're not going to penalize because he's already dead. But the other cases we're going to penalize. So there we had, again, this is a good example of where you can prove logically anything, right? You can kind of flip it on its side. Okay, moving on. So now we're in the second part of the Mishnah. If she gets married without the permission of the court, which means she must be holding by two witnesses, but the court didn't come in and say you can get married to him. It's not that the court didn't allow it, it's just nobody went to the court. So she can go back to her original husband because she was relying on two witnesses, right? And we're going to see in the words of Rav Sheshet, we're going to see, what else could she have done, right? Obviously, she can stay married. But we're going to see, maybe not obviously. So, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Hachi Hilchata. So the main thing that is going to get us started on a very long and bit of complicated discussion is, Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, this is the halacha, which is a little bit strange. Why is it strange? Because he should have said, right, we didn't see any machloket in the Mishnah. So why would you say this is the halacha if there's no machloket? So we're going to have two approaches. One approach is going to say there is a machloket, and one approach is going to say there's not a machloket. So the first approach is Rav Nachman. And he says, he's going to think there is a machloket, okay? And Rav is paskening like one side of the machloket. So he says, and then he's upset at him for it though. Gan v'ginu ve'lamalach, you sneaky person. You're kind of like a robber, like a thief coming in. Why? Why is he so upset with him? He says, Isfir alach ki Rabbi Shimon, ema halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. You should be straight and open about what you're doing. If you want to say the halacha is like the Mishnah, what you're really saying is, I paskin like Rabbi Shimon against the rabbis. Okay, why we think this is Rabbi Shimon, you'll see later. But also, if you noticed in the Mishnah, the last opinion for the previous case was Rabbi Shimon. He came in and said about this bi'an chalitza and all that. And then it says, he views this as if it's a continuation of Rabbi Shimon, and this is Rabbi Shimon's opinion only. But then he's upset at Rav because he said, you should have just said halacha ka Rabbi Shimon. Dishmatich ka Rabbi Shimon kazla, because what you're saying is basically Rabbi Shimon. And in which case, you should have said the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. Now, why is it so important that you say the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon? Well, because it's important to know that someone disagrees. Okay, now, according to this, the rabbis disagree and hold that she can't, even if she got married based on two witnesses, she can't go back to her original husband, okay, which is difficult. And that's what Rav Sheshet is going to say. No way, no how could somebody say that? But that's the assumption. So now, Rav Nachman continues and says, well, if you want to try to give me an answer to my question, you didn't want to say maybe halacha Rabbi Shimon because people would have thought that you hold like Rabbi Shimon in the previous, which was, right, right? If she does chalitza or she has a relationship with the brother for the purposes of yibum, she can exempt the tzara, right? Well, you don't hold like that, so therefore maybe that's why you didn't say halacha Rabbi Shimon. But that's not a good answer because Ema, you could have just said halacha Rabbi Shimon ba'achrona, and everyone would have known, right? You passed like Rabbi Shimon in the last part of the Mishnah. And then we know on that issue and not on that issue. And therefore, Rav Nachman takes issue with him. Why didn't he just say the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon? And in fact, we end with kasha. It is somewhat difficult. But now comes the second approach. Rav Sheshet says, Amar Rav Sheshet, Amina kinayim v'shachich vrav amar lahashmat. It's always a fun line to see. He says, Rav must have been sleeping or dozing when he said this following statement because it's ridiculous what he said. Why is it ridiculous? Because halacha bichlal de pligi. If you say the halacha is like this, it makes it sound like someone disagrees. And how could there possibly be someone who disagrees with this? My havalala me'abad, me'anas ansa. She was totally anus. Two witnesses came and said, your husband's dead. What more would she need to rely on? Two witnesses is always accepted. Why would we be penalizing her in any way, shape, or form? Makes no sense. For sure, nobody disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, which is really how we read the Mishnah, right? Seems obvious. Furthermore, he says, and now after this furthermore proof, we're going to now have a number of attempts to undo this question, the second part, and then we're going to even undo the first part, okay? Or try to undo the first part. His claim that what could she have done, right? We can't blame her. Later, we'll try to get rid of that, although we're not going to succeed. But first, we're going to deal with this second proof. And this is the complicated part of today's daf. The odd time. Furthermore, it says in a braita, Kol arayot shebetorah ein tzrichot imenu get. Okay, this goes back to our first Mishnah, the 15 women that exempt their tzara, all those arayot, the daughter, the mother, the this, all that. Okay? all those arayot, ein slichot hemenu get. You don't need a get from them. Chutz me'eshet ish sheniseit al pi beitin. Okay, if you marry someone who's forbidden to you by arayot, okay, one of those forbidden relationships, you don't need a get. Why don't you need a get? Because the marriage is not a valid marriage. We've talked about this many times. Ein kiddushin tofsim, right? Other than one exception to the rule. What's the one exception? Our case. What case though? Specifically, in eshet ish sheniseit al pi beitin, a married woman who goes by the court's ruling, and the court said you can get married. She got married. In that case, because the court said it, it's a valid marriage with the second guy. She's going to need a divorce. Now, here comes the inference from this braita. It sounds like al pi beitin hu debayagita, al pi edim lo bayagita. It sounds like only if the court got involved. But if it was just witnesses, she wouldn't need a get, it sounds like. So if I went by two witnesses, the husband had died, and I went and got married, I wouldn't need a get from the second husband. Now, here comes the question, money. What he wants to prove, remember, because otherwise you get confused, he wants to prove that Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis don't disagree about our Mishnah and think that if she went by two witnesses, she can go back to the first husband. Now, according to this, we're going to see that there's a machloket, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, about whether or not she needs to get al pi beitin, but everyone agrees that al pi edim lo bayagita. Now, if you don't need to get, again, we haven't seen this inside. This is where we're going, just so you understand where we're going. If everybody agrees that al pi edim lo bayagita, both Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, in other words, what we basically have to prove is that this braita is the rabbis against Rabbi Shimon, and then we have the rabbis saying al pi edim she doesn't need to get because the first marriage is valid, and that means she can go back to her first husband. Okay, that's the assumption. So they say the following: money. Ilema Rabbi Shimon al pi beitin mi by a get. If you're going to say this is Rabbi Shimon, and again, the inference from that braita, because the whole point is we want to say that braita is the rabbis, this other braita is Rabbi Shimon. You see they have a particular machloket, but they all agree, again, it doesn't say this explicitly, but the assumption is they all agree that if she went by witnesses, she doesn't need a get, and therefore it means her first marriage is valid. She can go back to the first husband. So once you say the braita, the first braita is the rabbis, and the second braita is Rabbi Shimon, you can then see that they all agree about our issue, even though they disagree about whether or not she needs a get from the second husband. In a beitin case, okay? In other words, the machloket is about a beitin case, but our case, which is just edim, there is no machloket, and therefore we assume they agree about our Mishnah, which is Rav Sheshet's whole proof. Why did you say halacha like our Mishnah when everybody agrees? So now the second braita is the following. So you can't say this is Rabbi Shimon because Rabbi Shimon from the second braita seems clear, although we're going to see not necessarily. But the first assumption of Rav Sheshet is, and we're going to have 4 ways to show that this isn't really clear, or 3 ways to show this reading of the braita isn't clear, and then one other way to reject it for a different reason. But hatanya, okay? If it's Rabbi Shimon, he doesn't need a get if she gets married based on the court. Because it says, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon splits between asu beitin behora'atan, which sounds like, right, the beitin ruled that she could get married. Now the case here is, the beitin rules she can get married with one witness, and al pi edim, when she goes by 2 witnesses. So asu beitin behora'atan, kizadon ish b'isha. If she goes like the court, then it's like she, right, was like a man sleeps with a woman intentionally, okay, a married woman intentionally, because it was only one witness and we're going to penalize her. Al pi edim kishkagat ish b'isha. If she does it based on 2 witnesses, it's like a shkaga, a mistake. Now, if it's a mistake, then what does that mean? She can, okay, now I'm looking at the chart. This is the first way to understand the braita. If it's a mistake, it means she can go back to her original husband. Now, what they infer from this braita, even though it doesn't say so, idi v'idi lo baya get. Now, neither case does she need a get. First of all, if it was intentional, she definitely doesn't need a get because she was definitely, right? She basically slept with this other man in a forbidden manner, right? She based it on one witness, but it's not a valid marriage. And the second one, it's like a shkaga. Of course, she's allowed back to the first husband. She was married to him originally. She obviously doesn't need a get from the second because we never viewed the second as anything. So we're going to assume that Rabbi Shimon doesn't require a get for either one of them. And therefore, if neither one requires get, let's go back to the first braita. All the arayot don't need get other than Eshadishini said al pi beitin, which means though only al pi beitin she needs a get, but with edim she doesn't need a get. So now, what can we infer from here? That braita is the rabbis. The second braita is Rabbi Shimon because it says Rabbi Shimon. In other words, those two don't go together. As soon as they say something different, it means there's two different opinions, but they all agree that al pi edim she doesn't need a get because she's really legit married to the first husband. So therefore, everyone agrees about the law in our Mishnah, al pi edim. She doesn't have to get divorced and she stays married to the first husband. So that's Rav Sheshet's proof. But comes the Gemara and says, no, we can have, and we're going to have three different alternative ways of reading this braita, in which case we can say, basically the braita doesn't contradict the first braita, in which case we could say it's all Rabbi Shimon, which means we have no idea what the rabbis say, and maybe the rabbis do disagree, as we view the simple reading of Rav. When he says the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, it sounds like maybe the rabbis disagree and are stricter with the woman and don't let her stay married to the first husband, even when she went by witnesses. Okay, that's going to be the gist. That what we want to basically say is somehow these two Mishnayot these two braitot don't go against each other, which means we can view them all as Rabbi Shimon. So the first one changes the wording a little bit. So they say, again, the first one was saying, Elalav Rabbanani, that braita must be Rabbanan. This is Rabbi Shimon. You see, though, that they all agree about the basic law. They just disagree about whether she needs a get. Second is, Laolam Rabbi Shimon, the braita, both braitas are Rabbi Shimon. V'taritzachi, how do you explain it then? What we basically have to say is, we have to show that there is a need for a get in the case of al pi beitin. And how are you going to show that? Well, you change the words. Rabbi Shimon Omer, asu beitin behora'atan, instead of saying kizadon ish ve'ish, you read it kikavanat ish be'isha. If it was one witness and the beitin says, well, you could get married based on this one witness, it's like when you married the second guy, it was like intent of a man with a woman, which means, right, just like any man who wants to marry a woman, and you need a get from it. So this would match now the braita, that you need a get if you go by the beitin. Then, ubaya gita, right? You'd need a get. Al pi edim, but if you just went by witnesses without the court, that's more like when you married husband number two, it was shelo b'chavanat ish b'isha. It's like, meaning the law is like, it's not really like it, but the law is like a man who sleeps with a woman without the intent to marry, okay? Just sleeping around with a non-married woman. And in that case, now, if a man sleeps with a woman not with the intent to marry, do they have to get a divorce? Of course not. So what we're saying is the distinction between case 1 and 2 in this braita is exactly the distinction in the first braita, that who's going to need a get if it's by beitin, who's not going to need a get if it's by witnesses, and then it matches perfectly, and then we could say the whole thing is Rabbi Shimon, in which case maybe the rabbis disagree, we don't know. And then Rav has where to say, we hold like Rabbi Shimon, the rabbis disagree. We just don't have a proof that the rabbis agree with him from this. Rabbi Ashi Amar, another reason. Now, if you remember, we said this whole thing about assuming they don't need a get was an inference from this braita. According to the next two interpretations, the subject of the braita was very specific. According to Rav Ashi, the subject was Linyani Surah Katani. We just want to know, is she forbidden to the first husband or not? That's a distinction. Not does she need a get from the second husband? Nobody ever talked about a get in this case, in which case this has nothing to do with get or not, in which case the first braita could match with this. We have no idea because this wasn't referring to get. So Linyani Surah Katani B'Haki Kamra, and this is how you should read. Asu beitin ba'oratan kizadon ish b'isha. He now goes back to the original language. We don't have to change the language here. We just say, it's like a man who intentionally slept with a married woman, and she becomes forbidden to her first husband. We know that law, right? A woman is an adulteress. She can't be back together with her first husband. And that's what it means. If the woman, again, this means she went by beitin, there was one witness, she agreed with the court, right? The court ruled, based on this one witness, you can marry him. But if it turns out he's alive, then you're forbidden to your original husband. But al pi edim, if there were witnesses, two witnesses, then it's kishkagat ish b'isha v'lo mitasal ba'ala. Then it's just accidental and you're not forbidden to go back to your husband. So then we basically say, according to this, this has absolutely nothing to do with get. And therefore, this maybe could work. We could still make this distinction that the braita said and say, this is Rabbi Shimon, who distinguishes between the get, whether or not you need to get from the second husband, that's a totally separate issue. In which case, Rabbi Shimon could be the author of the first braita, Rabbi Shimon could be the author of the second braita, and the rabbis maybe disagree with all of this, or at least, right, the point about al pi edim, maybe they also forbid her to go back to her original husband, and that's just another opinion that exists. It's just not in these braita. Ravina Amar le'inyan korban katani. We're now on Amud Bet. Ravina says, this is all, the subject is not isura, the subject is not get, the subject is you have to bring a sacrifice. And then asu beitim b'horatan, if the court ruled based on one witness, kizadon ish b'isha, then it's like you did it intentionally. Okay, now you didn't do it intentionally. You married this guy thinking because the court ruled, but since it was one witness and you didn't do your homework properly, we're going to penalize you. It's as if you intentionally slept with this other man, and lo matcha korban, you don't bring a sacrifice. Why not? Because the sacrifice is a korban chatat that you only bring if it's accidental, and this wasn't accidental enough to require you a korban. Remember, korban, to require you a korban is a benefit for you because you get to atone for your sin. In this case, we don't even allow you to atone for your sin. Asu beitim b'horatan kizadon ish b'isha v'lo matcha korban. Sorry, that we read already. Al pi edim though, kishkagad ish b'isha u'matcha korban. If it's based on witnesses' testimony, two witnesses, well, then when you married your second husband, it was clearly shkaga. And then, right, it's unwitting. And therefore, you would bring a sacrifice. Okay? So that's the way we understand three different understandings of this braita, which all knock out Rav Sheshet's proof, where he tried to prove that Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis clearly agree. This second braita basically ends up having nothing to do with the first braita or agrees with the first braita, in which case there could be out there an opinion of the Chachamim that's not in either one of these places. A fourth possibility to reject Rav Sheshet is to say, instead of saying chutz me'eshet ish, this first one said, all arayot you don't need to get unless it's eshet ish sheniseit al pi beitim, which would then infer if it's al pi beitim, yes, but by edim she wouldn't need a get because again, why would she need a get? Because she's fair and square married to her first husband, and that showed that if we say it's the rabbis, he agrees with Rabbi Shimon. According to this, it's al pi beitim and al pi edim. You need a get. It's both those cases. You do need a get. Why do you need a get? Because we're penalizing you because you're responsible. And then it shows that the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Shimon and they hold the woman responsible even if she followed two witnesses. She'd have to get divorced, right? Because we added that vav. It makes all the difference. And then basically we do see there is a machloket, and that resolves the issue of Rav. Okay, that basically when Rav said the halacha is this way, there actually is a machloket. Now we start with the question, Mativ Ulla. Mi amrina, my havale le'me'aban. Actually, I'll keep the chart up. We have another chart for this. So now we say, wait a minute. We're now going to have, okay, you can see here by the chart, we're going to have 6 Mishnayot, 6 Mishnayot that are going to basically create a difficulty on the first thing Rav Sheshet said. Before that, we were dealing with the second. His first proof, what can they expect from this woman? It's not her fault. Of course we're going to, right? Of course it's not an issue. Of course the rabbis, nobody's going to blame her. There were two witnesses. So now we're going to show 6 Mishnayot where the law is the same as before. We're going to penalize the woman even though theoretically it's not her fault. And then in each one, we're going to end up saying it really was somewhat her fault. And then that goes back to our case. Well, our case, it really wasn't her fault because she went by 2 witnesses. So here are our cases. Mativ Ulla, mi amrina, my havale le'me'abad. Do we really say it wasn't her? Like, what could she have done? Because look at these cases where also we assume what could she have done, and yet we penalize her. It says in the Mishnah, if you write your get and you write it according to the Roman law, okay, or l'shem malchut madai, or l'shem malchut yavan, some foreign malchut, libinyan habayit, lichurban habayit. Okay, these are things that you're not supposed to do. Hayab b'mizrach b'katav b'ma'arav. You were in the east and you wrote that you were in the west. In the west, you wrote you were in the east. Ma'arav katav mizrach. Teitzei mizeh u'mizeh v'chol drachim ha'eluba. If the sofer, the scribe, wrote some mistake in the get about, the years, counted to some rule that they weren't supposed to, wrote the location was wrong, well, your get is invalid. And you basically, if you got married based on this invalid get, you have to get divorced. All the things we said in our Mishnah are true for this as well. What could she have done? So they say, of course, what do you mean, what could she have done? She should have read the get. It was her fault for not reading the get. By the way, you see here that women must have been illiterate. Otherwise, you can't expect them to read the get. Or maybe they could at least have someone look over the get. Okay, each one of these proofs is brought by a different rabbi. Okay, here we have I'll pull up the presentation. Okay, we have one story today that's in a presentation. So we now have a woman. Here we go. So we have Reuven who's married to Yael. And sorry, I skipped the first case. How did I get to this? Sorry. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Reuven's married to Yael and he dies. And he's also married to Shula. And he has a brother, Shimon. So now Shimon does Yibum with Yael. Shula now says, okay, I can go marry whoever I want. And Niseit, she goes and marries Moshe. But then Yael turns out was an Ilonit. Now, an Ilonit is not obligated in Yibum because she can't have children. And then her Tzara Shula is not permitted to have married anybody. She has to do Yibum. So, but Shula already married someone. So she now has to get divorced from Moshe, and she needs Chalisa from Shimon. And she's messed up like all the women, like the woman in our Mishnah. So again, it's not her fault. What could she have done? So the Gemara says, she should have waited to see if the woman was right. Obviously, the woman didn't have simanim at that point. So she should have waited until she got to the age where we determined this woman's an Ilonit. She's clearly never going to get of age to have children. All the cases in our first Mishnah, remember that if it's you fall to Yibum to your father, for example. So you don't do Yibum. And not only that, but your tzara is exempt. But there's one exception, which is if it turns out you're an Ilonit, then you don't exempt the tzara. So again, similar case. So there was an arayot. If she fell to her father in Yibum, they permitted the tzara. The tzara went and got married. They got married to other people. And then the arayot ended up being the woman who was forbidden, whose father it was, she ended up being an Ilonit, in which case they're all obligated in Yibum, but yet they already married someone else. Again, obviously the Gemara is going to answer like we did before. She should have waited. This is a great case. See, people don't always pay attention to what they're signing or what they're doing. So the sofer writes the get for the man, gives it to them, right? They're supposed to give it to the man to give to the woman. He writes a shoval, which is a receipt for the woman that she received her get. And he's supposed to give the get to the man and the shovar to the woman, but he flips it by accident. He gives the get to the woman, the shovar to the man hands over the shovar to the woman hands over the get to the man. She's obviously not divorced because she never received the get from the husband. So let's read it inside. Right? Natan get li shav shovar li. She gave the wrong one to each one. The couple didn't even pay attention. They just passed over the document without looking. Over time, we realized one day he's looking through his papers and he realizes, why do I have my wife's get in my paperwork? Again, they have to get divorced. And from the second husband, right? Why do you say it wasn't her fault? Again, obviously it was. She should have looked at it. All these are the same. They're messed. A get that's a problematic one. So if it didn't have her correct name, or it didn't have the correct name of her city, or his name in the city. So again, if get is about, this is why we're super careful. We write different spellings, different, right? Everything, just to make sure that the get is valid. So they should have read the get. There's another get. I'm not going to get into all the details, but it's a get where you fold each line and someone signs on each line. And then if there's a signature missing, it again invalidates the get. So again, what's the problem? She should have read the get. We're going to end with a story. He tried to rule in a case based on this concept of what could she have done, right? It's not her fault, and therefore, did it make her tetzei mizeh umizeh? Okay, this is a case where the woman got married based on two witnesses, and until now, we're basically assuming that we hold like Rabbi Shimon, even if the rabbis maybe disagree, right? And Rav Sheshet basically said, it's clearly not her fault, and we brought all these Gemaras that said, well, even then we penalize even when it's not her fault, and to each one we answered, well, it really was her fault in all those cases, but the two witnesses clearly wasn't. So Armaleh, Rav Huna. So he wanted to rule for this woman that she could go back to her first husband. But, and this is a kind of sad way to end our daf, but Amalei Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yoshua Rav Papa. V'hatani kol ha'matniata. But wait, we brought all those questions from all those 6 Mishnayot. It seems like even sometimes when the woman's not to blame, she ends up in this difficult situation where we have to make her get divorced. So Rav Papa says, Vilav Shaninu, but what do you mean? We gave answers to all those things. To which, and this is just interesting and it's sad, but it's interesting in terms of the way they view all these answers that are given in the Gemara. You can't always paskin like that. Just because we asked a question and someone answered something, does that mean we can rely on it? Not necessarily. Upasak, okay? And apparently he accepted this and he wouldn't let her go back to her original husband. Okay, so here we see that even when the Gemara gives answers to questions, we can't necessarily rule based on those answers. And this is something that comes up many times. When you have an answer to a question, right? I'll give you the most famous example or one famous example that you know about. Is how long you're supposed to keep candles lit. And there's 2 answers given. One is what it means to tell you is you have to light candles until the last person leaves the shuk and not later than that. The other answer is that's how much time you have to do it from Shkia until that. That's how long your candles have to light. They have to be lit for half an hour. That's the time that people would, it would be the end of the day until they would take for them to get home. Now, those were 2 answers given to some contradiction in the text. It either means this or it means that. And then there's this big debate. Do we take them both la halacha? Is it one la halacha? Is it a suffix? We don't know which, so we can be lenient or not. And there's a whole big debate about how seriously we take those answers given in the Gemara. Are they taken as halacha or not? With that, we'll end. Have a great day, everybody. Shavua tov.